Hello, friends of the paranormal. I'm your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
Okay, it's kind of a cool, dreary day, but I'm okay.
Yeah, you can tell I'm not in my normal short-sleeved golf shirt. I got sweatshirt on today. So yes, it's winter in PA, even though that doesn't officially start till December 20th, 21st, somewhere around there.
Like that.
The winter solstice. For those of you who are just finding us, we thank you. Please consider subscribing or click the like. If you are returning, we thank you again for coming back. You've already clicked the subscribe, so thanks for that. But also consider clicking the like. We do see that as a reward for what we're doing. We have the Facebook groups. We have our email address where you can send us ideas. And we've had some correspondence lately from people outside of the U.S., which is nice to hear that we've got an international audience, even though our audience isn't. We're definitely not. You're not going to see the YouTube plaque behind us for a long time, but we do thank all of you for your subscribership and listening. We really, really do appreciate it. You're the reason why we do this. So, unless you have something to add, I think I should ask, what's our topic?
The topic is what walks in the woods.
We've touched on that a little bit before, and
We
you've kind of
have.
ruined the woods for me, really.
I'm sorry. I did wait till after you camped to do this one, but because I knew. But I'm fascinated with all the stories of things that happen in the woods. I live in the woods, so I guess it doesn't faze me any. But So I wanted to talk about some very bizarre stories. There's a lot of them, really interesting things that happen in the woods. We're touching on some, but we are going to visit them again, not before the holidays, I'm sure, but to visit them again and talk about even more interesting things that I've discovered while I was doing the research for this episode. But I want to fill it out a little bit and see where we're headed. So I wanted to start with just a very odd story. This happened in June of 1983. It was a beautiful summer, afternoon. This little girl, she's 4 years old. Her name was Nylene K. Marshall. And her stepfather was a man whose hobby was ham radio operating. And he belonged to a radio club. So for those who don't know, there's ham radios, and they have like these little organizations where people who are really interested hang out, get together, talk back and forth on the radios and do all this stuff. And they apparently had decided to do a weekend camping trip with a whole bunch of the people and their families. So she's there with her mom and her siblings and her stepdad. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful afternoon. They were playing outside in the creek, and then come down to it was just a little walk down to the path where the pavilions were, and everybody was going to spend the weekend, and it was just going to be awesome. And like all the other kids, Nalene was having a blast. Her older brother and sister were supposed to kind of keep an eye on her a little bit, and her mom had given them the chance to go wading in the little creek, and they came back, and they were on their way back from that to the picnic area. And being smaller, she was lagging about 3 or 4 steps behind. You know how the little ones are.
Yep, I do know. Yep.
And they're walking along and kind of turn around to tell her to hurry up, and they take a few more steps and come on. They want to get back down to the picnic area and get something to eat. And according to her siblings, she was there right behind him about 3 or 4 steps. They turned around, took a few more steps. She still hadn't caught up, so they turned around to growl and, come on, hurry up, Nylene. And she was gone. There were lots of other kids around. Nobody saw anything. She was there, and then she wasn't. And this would turn out to be one of the largest hunts for a child in the history of the area. So the place they were at was called, it was in the Elkhorn Mountains of the Helena National Forest in Montana. And you know, at first everybody's looking around, like, no, where could she have gone? The other kids didn't see her go back past them. Her siblings didn't see her go forward. There were no other people around, and she's just gone. And this is a story that is just so common, obviously made more recognizable by the 411 books and David Paulides. And they finally, after they can't find her, they reach out to the park authorities, who reach out to the police. And within hours, they have what ends up being the largest manhunt for 10 days for this child. No one saw anybody. Nobody saw a car go away. Nobody saw anything. And all the kids said exactly the same thing. She was just there. She took another step and then she was gone. It was like she just disappeared. And you hear those stories so often. And I wanted to just sort of touch base on it. By the way, Nylene was never found. To this day. There's no, no reconciliation, no any idea of what happened to her. There were lots of false leads throughout the years and what have you, but at no point did anybody ever come up with a realistic possibility or clue. And there is no idea what happened to this child. So, those are the kind of stories we're used to, but there are so many other stories that are more dark. We're going to visit Arkansas now, and this is an eyewitness account. So a lady and her husband rented a little cabin in the forest in a state park in Arkansas. And, it was beautiful. The cabin had one wall that was nothing but windows, and it overlooked like a sheer drop down into a river. So, it was just absolutely gorgeous. And she loved it. It was great, except there was just this odd feeling. She said she didn't know if it was just because of the big wall of windows that she wasn't used to, but she kept feeling like somebody was watching her. And it made no sense, because literally you're just looking out over a river, and, it's 30, 40 feet up in the air, from the top of that hill to where the windows were. But anyhow, this is her story. She said that the first night that they stayed in this cabin, they began to find that there was something strange going on. As they fell asleep that first night, there was beating that started on all sides of the cabin, all at the same time. Loud, eerie, fast-paced, like drumming, moving from wall to wall and then up onto the roof and back. And it was everywhere all at once. And then they jump out of bed and they run down to the living room area, and you can't see anything outside, because you know how the windows reflect in the darkness, so you can't really see anything beyond the glass. You can just see your reflection coming back at you.
Well, if you have light on the inside,
Yeah.
yes.
So, they're trying to figure out what's going on, and all of a sudden the gas-powered fireplace shoots into a full roar, even though it was turned off. The TV begins to flip on and off by itself, and the lights begin to blink, although there should be nothing to cause that. And then the fireplace turns off, and then the fireplace roars back to life, and it just continues like this for almost an hour. And then it all gets silent. They're terrified at this point. They're just, what on earth? And then as the darkness, or as the silence falls over the place, they begin to hear whispering. Couldn't tell what the words were, but they were whispering. Just outside the walls. And you could just make out there was something talking out there, but not what it was. After the first night, they had booked it for 4 nights. They talked about what to do. Should they leave? What should they do? And it spent all the money they could afford to spend for this vacation. So her husband was loath to say, I give up. And so for that next 3 nights, she ends up sleeping with the hall lights on, and the lights in the bedroom, and the door is shut and locked. But every night they hear the pounding. And on the 3rd night, something new introduces itself. As they're laying in bed and they have the lights on, they start to see shadows going across the wall, reaching under the door. And, the lights are on. You can see really clearly what's going on, but you can see these dark, shadowy hand-like things reaching under the door. There was a gap of about 2 inches, she said. So you could get your fingers under. And she said we got to the point where on the third night we decided it wasn't worth it. If we made it through the night, we were leaving in the morning. We weren't staying that last night. And they speculated about if somebody else was like trying to play a prank on them, how could they have done it? But when the shadows started moving,
yeah, that's not a person.
yeah, I mean it's just, she's like, that was the night that she decided she wasn't going camping again, ever, anywhere. So when first light came, they packed up their stuff and they moved on because they just couldn't handle what was going on anymore. And I can't imagine. And she said they talked to the people that, at the Park Service and asked if there was any stories, and they were very circumspect, like, oh, what are you talking about? Of course not. Well, maybe. I mean, no, we never have any problems with those cabins. She speculated in the article she wrote about, at first they talked about, like I said, people trying to scare them out, playing a prank. Then they thought about Bigfoots, and they thought they might have figured that part of it out, and maybe the other stuff, they couldn't explain the fireplace, the lights, that kind of thing. But then when the shadows started climbing across the walls and under the door, that was enough. I can't imagine spending, 3 nights locked in the woods living with that.
As much as I'm enamored with the paranormal, I think that would be slightly past my limit too. Yeah, I think I would also not worry about the last night's worth of expenditure.
Yep, no, I'm not me either. So the next story I actually chose it because I wanted to tell, it reminded me very much of a friend of mine. I have some friends who do Bigfoot investigations, and they go up into Clearfield County a lot and do it. And they have found a place in Clearfield County where there are consistent long-term sightings of these creatures. But as they're camping there, they've also learned there's other things going on there. For example, they will see these colored lights. They describe them as maybe 5 times the size of a firefly, and they blink. They're yellow, blues, greens, pinks, and they just blink, and they blink in different patterns. And they don't know what they are. And then they said they'll just sort of take off across the sky and wiggle and zigzag all over and then blink out. And this has been going on for, I don't know, 15 years. They go up there, multiple times a year and document it. I've seen videos of them doing it. And this one reminded me of that. So this is something that I've heard about in the woods by other people as well. And this is orbs of light in the woods. So this particular story took place in the Sylvania Wilderness in upper part of Michigan. They don't give you a time frame, but they do talk about the fact that they had rented a campsite on the lake, and it was one that was only accessible by canoe, so you wouldn't be an easy place to get to other than if you were going to canoe across the lake to this spot. And the person and his significant other were sitting at the campfire like you do, and you talking and what have you the first night. And they were just getting ready to go to bed when they looked up and they saw what they described as an orb of light floating in the woods behind the tent. It was about 1 foot in diameter. It was white. It gave off just a faint light. Wasn't bright. And it moved slowly and steadily through the forest, eventually disappearing either into or behind a tree. And this began what would end up being for them several days of seeing this. It was, it was pretty unusual. They make a point of saying there were no cars that were coming down the roads that you could see something reflective. Again, can't get in there unless you're canoeing in. A very remote site. It wasn't fireflies, and it was always the same thing. They would sit up at night and they would watch, and they said when you would see it, you would feel unsettled, as though you were witnessing something you weren't meant to see. And the author said that they They spent the whole time there, and every night they'd sit up half the night watching this thing moving. It would go into the forest and then it would come back, as if interested in seeing how they would react, or in watching them. And you would get this terrible sense that you were being watched. And the person who wrote the article said, I have to wonder if these were the will-o'-the-wisps of folklore and legend, and if so, were they truly spirits, or what could they be? Whatever it was, we saw it every single night. So I don't know what it was, but it does sound kind of weird. And like I said, I know of places where people tell me stories of seeing things like that. So the next story is told was a gentleman talking about his brother bought a property out in the Midwest, and it was 30 miles from everywhere. No cell service, no anything, So there's no light pollution, there's no paved roads, nothing. And he goes out to help his brother. They're going to clean it up. Somebody had turned that spot into a dump at some point, literally. And so they're cleaning up this mess, and they're cutting back the brush and getting ready to help get things ready to put a house in back there for the brother. And so he and his brothers, he had another brother, there was three brothers and a couple buddies, would go out and work on the weekends. On the very first weekend they were there, everybody was sleeping in a tent except for one of the friends who had a fifth wheel, and he brought it, and he had a generator and he had a radio, and that was like the only civilization, if you will, that was there. The cell phones were useless. Everything else was just non-existent at that point. And the first night they were there, this guy says he got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, climbs out of the tent, and he hears music playing. He doesn't think a whole lot about it. It's like faint, and he's like, he must have that generator going or something. He's playing the radio in the middle of the night. So he recognized the song. He went to the bathroom. He goes back to the tent, goes back and lays down, doesn't think much about it till the next morning. And when they're at breakfast, before they get started with the work for the day, he says to the dude, did you forget you left the radio on last night? And he's like, I didn't have the radio on last night. And he's like, no, you must have. I heard it in the middle of the night. And then another guy chimes in and goes, yeah, I heard it too. And another guy, and this first gentleman says the name of a song. He says it was playing this song. And the other guy looked at him and he said, no, I heard the radio, but it was playing a different song. And the next guy said a different song's name as well. Nobody heard the same song, but they all heard it playing at about the same moments. They woke up in their tents and were hearing it, but it was different for each of them.
Interesting.
I thought that was interesting. So they discussed it a little bit, and they realized that everybody but the guy who had the fifth wheel had heard the music, but again, a totally different song for each of them. So that night, they're tired, they finish up, they wash up a little bit, get something to eat, and they're sitting around the campfire talking and what have you, and they're wondering, what's going on, and they all go to bed, and in the middle of the night, one of them gets up to go smoke a cigarette, and they hear the music again. So he wakes everybody else up real quick, and he's like, okay, tell me what the song is. And they all heard a different song, even though they are now sure they're all hearing it at the same time.
Sure. Yeah.
And the guy said, I honestly don't know what to tell you. It's just how it was. And it's still that way. I've gone back several times to help my brother to do things, and I'll stay there at night, but now I won't sleep in a tent. I sleep in the SUV. I lock the doors. I know it might sound dumb, but I know everybody heard different music. I know there were no functioning radios, and there was no electricity, and we began to check the generator, and it was not on. And it wasn't coming from the fifth wheel, because they checked on that.
Okay.
And he's like, I don't know. Even the dude from the fifth wheel came tumbling out the second night, and he could hear music, but nobody could figure out where it came from. And he's like, there's 30 miles to the nearest house, so I don't see how that could have been it.
And especially if they're hearing different songs. To me, that that says that they're hearing it inside their own heads. So something made it happen there. They weren't actually hearing it with their ears.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's an interesting phenomena that they would
Yeah,
experience the same thing, but differently somehow.
and especially if it was, I don't want to say reproducible, because that's how you troubleshoot any problem in the realms that I deal with anyway. You're looking for reproducibility. So
Right.
um, yeah, but if he even came back after that, when his brother was living there, and they could still, if they could still experience the same thing, then I'd be hard pressed to try to even think what that could be.
No clue, but it was interesting. So we're going to move over to England for a little bit. There's a site called British Paranormal, and from that site I found this interesting story. There was a fisherman who was fishing, and this is something that's apparently he finds out later happened multiple times. And he's just doing what you do when you fish. You cast the line and you sit there and you wait and you kind of watch the water go by and you just sit there quietly. He's all by himself, beautiful day. And this would have been in an area called Humber. And he's watching the water, casting, doing his thing, hanging out, being quiet and peaceful. And all of a sudden, he kind of does a double take because there's a woman floating in the water, face up, and her eyes are open. Her hair is just kind of floating in the water, and she's wearing a military uniform from about World War II.
Oh, okay.
And at first he thinks she's she's a drowning victim, one way or the other, suicide, whatever. And so he literally like jumps up out of his chair and he tries to reach out and like grab her hair to pull her up out of the water, and she's gone. He's really rattled because she looked really real.
Mm-hmm.
Solid, completely solid until he plunged his hand into the water. Well, he doesn't even know what to make of this. So he calls his buddies who are further down the water and tells them what he saw, and they can tell he's serious. Like he's rattled, he's scared. And he's like, I don't want to be here. I'm just going to leave. If you guys want to hang out, you can hang out. They're like, no, 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 dude, we'll all go. Hang on, give us a minute. So they pull their stuff together real quick and jump in the vehicle and they're headed back home. And they saw a little pub when they got to the nearest town, and they decided to pull over there and, have a beer and just kind of talk it out now that they're away from that area. He's a little calmer now. And they're talking it out and what have you, and in this little pub, and somebody overhears them and they said, "Ah, you saw the Lady of Humber, didn't you, in the water?" And they're like, "The Lady of Humber?" And they tell this story that she's been seen many times floating along, and when you try to reach out for her, she just fades into nothingness. So he decides to do a little bit of research, and he learns that this area has a significant history that might explain what he saw. So during World War II, there was a lot of fierce fighting in that particular area, a lot of fatalities as well. And there was a British airship, an R-38, that was plummeted into that estuary at Humber, and 44 of the 49 crew members died there in that water. This happened on August 23rd of 1921. There are records. And he said, I have to wonder if the ghostly woman was one of the many dead who died in that particular crash. I don't know who she was. I only know that the local history states she's been seen ever since World War II. And I have to wonder if others will see her now. And if you see her in Humber, don't plunge into the water. You can't save her. She's a ghost. And I just thought that was a really interesting story.
Yeah,
Can
especially
imagine.
in
Go ahead.
uniform, because in that time you didn't have women combatants. I mean, yeah, sure, women had other roles to do, but I don't think you saw women combatants. I mean, you wouldn't even see the same uniforms.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, well, I mean, this is exactly what he described. Maybe she was, their version of what we had of were wax and what have you. And they
Mhm.
also had a whole group of women who did decoding that were dressed in military uniforms. Then their
Mm.
job, did you ever hear of Beckley Square?
No, but here I'm trying to apply. U.S. military knowledge that I have, with that.
Right.
So I guess, yeah, it's certainly possible. Yeah.
So, but it's an interesting story, isn't it?
Very so. Yeah. Mhm.
I thought it was pretty cool. So we're going to visit another lake. This was in the United States, and the gentleman who's writing the story tells about him and his cousins were out fishing on a lake, and he doesn't tell you where the lake is. He says he doesn't want to because it would kind of give everybody an idea of where he lived, and he doesn't want any publicity. He said, but we were just fishing, typical evening, and suddenly, how if you live in a city, you think of being in the country is quiet. If you live in the country, I promise you at night, there's crickets and all kinds of night birds and all kinds of sounds and what have you. It's loud in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And it is, you got crickets and owls and all this other stuff.
Yep. Just try to do nighttime summer EVPs outside someplace. You'll know how much noise there
Oh,
is.
yes. I've got lots of those trying to do that. So they're all hanging out, they're fishing, and all of a sudden, dead silence. And you notice it immediately, like something's wrong. And the animals in the everything will stop sometimes if something bad's going to happen. Like if a wild animal, like a wild cat or something's coming through, or a bear or something, like everything seems to know something's going to happen and they just all quit. You'll hear that sometimes. You hear those stories a lot with Bigfoot stories as well. There's people will talk about suddenly there was silence in the woods. It was as though everything was holding its breath. And that's basically what he's trying to say. And he said they're sitting there fishing and they were talking, and then all of a sudden it was silent. And he said we were trying to figure out what had happened. Why did they all stop at the same time? Because it's a cacophony of noise in the summer. You got the crickets, the katydids, the owls hooting and all this other stuff going, the wind rustling the leaves in the tree. It's just loud. And it all stopped. And he said we were sitting there in complete utter silence. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this very loud scream that pierced the night. The loud screaming came from behind us. He said I turned to my cousin, and by this time my cousin's face was pale. And he said, did you hear that? And I said, yes, I did. And we were looking at each other because we couldn't figure out what it was. And so we sat there, but it passed. And after about an hour, we all kind of calmed down and went back to fishing. We had our gear and stuff there, and we had a little fire, and we're going to get back to it. And then we decided we're going to, call it a night and get ready to go home. We pack up and we're headed for the truck when all of a sudden the leaves begin to rustle behind them. And at first they're thinking it's a bear or something coming up through, kind of barreling through, because bears are large and they kind of lumber and they can crash through the brush pretty loudly. And that's what they're hearing. And he said, we get into the truck, and it's just as we're getting ready to pull out, he turns on the truck and the lights come on, and there standing in front of the truck is a woman right in front of us, only a few feet away. She's dirty looking and disheveled, a little beat up with some blood stains on what looks like a nightgown. And he said one of us opened the window and yelled, hey, are you okay? Do you need help? She just stared at him. He said, and then she kicked her head back and began to scream. It was the same scream we had heard before. And he said, we didn't know what to do. One of my cousins yelled, just drive past her, just drive past her. And we did. So we drove down the dirt road, got out of there, thought about telling the cops, and then thought, what the hell do you tell them? You saw what? They're going to say you're crazy. He said, but we made a pact that we would never go back there again. And we kept an eye out, waiting for news, like for somebody to have found a body or something. And nothing ever came of it. And he said, I have to wonder what that was we saw in the woods that night. I don't think it was human. I have no clue, but I've heard stories of stuff like that. That I thought at first when they said the scream, it was going to turn out to be a Bigfoot story. And
I was thinking bobcats because they scream.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I figured since it was in a paranormal website, maybe it was going to turn out to be a Bigfoot. And so I just thought that was really interesting. So we're going to go to France for the next story. There's the story is from a gentleman who was ex-military, French military, and he's fishing in one of these little lakes. He said it was kind of a secluded space, and it had been used for military training back in World War II. He knew that. You could still see some of the old abandoned buildings and he had heard some stories about, what had gone on there during World War II. But mostly he just goes out there to fish. He said, just it's a really remote location and it's kind of a cool place to hang out for an afternoon. So he's out there fishing, and he said all of a sudden he's floating in his little boat on the lake, and he's got his lure out there thrown in the water, and he said all of a sudden I felt like everything stopped and I could feel something watching me. And everybody has had that moment when something's looking at you but you can't tell what it is. And he said I could feel it, and I knew whatever it was moving toward me. And I know that sounds crazy, he said, but because I'm in the lake, but it was moving toward me. And he said I remember thinking, this is crazy, you need to stop this, you're letting all this get to your head and yada yada. And he's trying to talk himself down off the ledge,
Mm-hmm.
the way you would. And he said I managed to be okay, I was cool, and I got back to the land and I was all right. So I'm telling myself, this is, ridiculous, just stay cool. He said, so I finish up and I'm thinking I'm gonna pack up and get out of here before the darkness falls and it gets all misty, because in the water it gets really misty in the middle of the night in some places. And he had experience with this before, so he said I decided to get ready and get out of there. He said, and as I'm starting to pack up, I noticed that one of the it's a bite alarm. He had some, you have the different fishing poles,
Mm-hmm.
and they have these little alarms that'll go off to let you know something's pulling on your lure. And he's like, I hadn't pulled them all in yet, and one of my bite alarms goes off, and I knew that meant there's a fish on the other end. So I I reached out to grab the pole, and something tugged hard at me. And he's like, I thought, oh wow, that's a big one. And then the line went slack. And he said, I turned on the spotlight, and when I did, standing on the water, not under the water, not in the water,
Mm.
on the water, was the silhouetted face of a helmeted German soldier peering at me. He said, I panicked. I, left my stuff, came back the next day, didn't talk to anybody for a little bit, went back a couple weeks later, like he needed to go back and kind of reassure himself. And he said at that point I met one of the wardens, and I'm guessing these are like our park rangers from how he describes it. And he said I was talking to to the warden, what we would call park ranger, who told me that the chateau that was on the lake had been the site of fierce fighting when the Americans liberated that part of France. The Germans had fled into the woods only to be ambushed by a patrol in reserve, and they were all killed and buried around that lake. I'm not going back there fishing ever again. He had no clue any of that had happened until he returned after his event. So the idea that maybe it was, superstition or power suggestion don't really come into play. He just knew that there had been barracks and stuff there, but he had no idea that those soldiers had been killed at that lake and buried along the shore where he was fishing.
But standing on the water,
Standing
yeah, because
on,
if you're thinking about, like something residual, let's say there didn't used to be a lake there and it was flooded to make a lake or something like that. Even so, where there's water, that means that, and unless they did some kind of excavation, that would have been a lower area than where he was. So that, even so, yeah, that's still that's very curious now that I think about that even more. But standing on the, yeah, that would certainly increase the shock value.
it would for me.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to visit East Beach in Rhode Island now. Now, East Beach was in the 1700s. There were these little villages and groups of men who were what they called wreckers. And in different places, they had different names for them. But basically what they did is in the 17 and early 1800s, they would take lanterns and they would go out and they would wave them to try to catch a ship and get the ship's attention. And they would try to convince the ship that they were like a lighthouse, like a little lighthouse window. We're talking 1700s, they weren't bright like they are today. And they would basically ground the ship, and then they would
Ooh.
kill the crew and steal the spoils. And there are lots of stories of this happening along the shores of, the United States and Canada. They would just waylay these people, murder them all, and then take everything on the ship. And so this gentleman's out there on the water in East Beach, Rhode Island. This would have been in early 2000s. And he said he hadn't heard anything about that at the time, but he said, I was fishing with my father, and when we got to the beach, we saw these odd drag marks in the sand. We didn't really think much about it at the time. They were out, we got settled, we went fishing for a while. He said we brought our German Shepherd, and at first the dog was having a blast, kind of, how dogs will just run into the water and back out and just kind of enjoy the ability to run free for a while. The dog was doing great, and then all of a sudden the dog stopped, went back to the men, and kind of started whimpering as though he was afraid of something, like trying to get them to move, and they didn't know what was going on. Now, this is a modern parking lot. You walk down this little path, and there's these places that they've kind of hollowed out where you can sit your stuff and fish. It's a park. It's a state park type thing, And he said all of a sudden we saw lights coming up out of the dunes. It was getting dusky, and we saw lights coming up out of the dunes. They were planning to do night fishing. So they had all their stuff gathered up to do that as well. They were going to fish the afternoon and the evening and well into the night, and then pack up and go home. And he said we got a good look as we saw the lights moving forward towards us through the dunes. And he said, whatever it was, it scared us. It scared us so bad, we just cut our lines and threw our stuff in the back of the truck, literally lifted the dog into the back of the truck, and we're getting ready to get out of there. And he said, my dad jumped in the driver's seat, and I quickly got into the passenger seat. And as we looked, there were 4 of these lights coming toward us now, not 1, not 2, but 4. And they were waving these lights, swinging them. And my dad kicked on the truck, and headlights kicked in, and we could see them. They were 4 men wearing shabby looking colonial clothes like you would see in an old movie. He said at that point, we knew we were out of there. He said they were walking toward us, and there's ratty old colonial clothes. And it was only later, when I started to do research, that I found out that this was one of the areas where the wreckers used to lure ships and kill their crews. And he said, I know it sounds insane, but I think their spirits walk there still looking for people to attack. And we might have been those people if the dog hadn't started to spook us and made us want to leave.
I'd never heard of wreckers before like that.
Yeah, I've heard stories of, and I've heard other different names for them, but basically it's the same idea. They would beach a ship and kill the crew, and then steal all the bounty, whatever was in it, whatever goods there were. And you'll hear those stories up and down the Atlantic coast in particular. When I was in Salem, Massachusetts, and Boston, there were stories that I heard of something along those lines. And I just thought it was, can't imagine seeing that coming out of nowhere. But it reminded me of a story. I'm going to tell another story. So there's a business that in my hometown where I grew up. It sits about 4 miles outside of town, and what it is it's now a drug and alcohol rehab. It used to be originally for teenagers that were in trouble with the law, and it was a place to house them till they were either sentenced or commuted time, or whatever happened. And this was what this facility was for at that point in time. And it has a lot of ghost stories attached to the property, because the main house on this property is the original structure from the early 1800s. But one of the guys who worked there told me this amazing story. He was coming back into town from this facility. It was the middle of the night. He had worked late, like a shift and a half, to cover until somebody else could get in there and relieve him. So it was well after midnight, he estimated. And he said he was driving in, and he was always driving slow through there because it's very rural, so there's a lot of deer. And you can't make any time because you're going to end up hitting a deer. And for those who don't know it, in Pennsylvania, deer are probably the most dangerous thing on the highway. And we have a lot of accidents and fatalities due to that. So everybody's pretty aware of it. And he's not thinking anything about it, and he other than just, you know, stay slow because those deer come flying out of those fields. And across the road runs parallel to the Juniata, one of the tributaries of the Juniata. And there are these old canal and railroad bridges out there, okay?
Okay.
And they're just sitting there. Nobody uses them for anything. They're just a relic from the past. And you don't even notice them probably unless you're literally looking for them, just because they're part of the scenery and they've kind of gotten overgrown. So, but he's gone through this area, and he said from the field, there's a culvert there at the edge of the field. And he said, I saw a man. He was an African-American man. He had on short pants, like knee-length shorts, a little bit over his knees. I'm thinking he's talking about breeches that came down over the knee and buckled or buttoned, and a shirt. And he had a lantern, and he was waving the lantern. And he said he was motioning like to come on, but not to him, not to the guy on the highway, but to somebody in the field. And he said, I stopped the car at that point and I watched, and 4 more black men, all similarly dressed, came out, and 2 of them had lanterns with them. And this guy was pointing them towards the old railroad bridge. And he said they were moving very furtively, as though they were trying to get this done without anybody seeing them. And he said, I'm sitting in the car, I'm totally stopped. I keep watching the rearview mirror in case another car comes up behind me, but it's the middle of the night, there's not much traffic, and I'm watching these guys with awe. Like, who are they? Where did they come from? Why are they dressed so weird? And he said the 4 men scurried down towards the railroad bridge, and the other man was pointing, and he's like, I think he was talking. I could see him gesticulating and going on as though he were talking. And then he said the man went back toward the culvert and climbed down into the culvert area. And then I couldn't see them and him. And then I said, I watched the light flicker from those 2 lanterns, and then they were gone. So what he came to learn afterward, because he was interested in the subject, obviously, was that during the Underground Railroad days, they would take people and tell them to catch the train through there, that the engineers that were coming through there were sympathetic and would slow the train down so they could jump aboard and get to Hollidaysburg, where they could keep on going and get help.
Yeah, the whole story, I was thinking Underground Railroad, but
yeah. But he witnessed something so out of time, because, you know, this had to have happened in the early 1800s. So anyhow, when I read that story, it kind of took me back to this story this gentleman had told me. And I just thought it was a really interesting story. So this next story took place in October of 1995, and it was a man and his family who were out in the White Mountains of Arizona. And they were looking for a place to camp. It was this man, his wife, his children, and their pet. They were on a vacation, and they were going to go camping and fishing. And apparently the man did not plan it well. It was just like one of those, we'll go out and we'll find a place and rent a spot to camp kind of deals. So they're driving through this park area, and they haven't found any place to camp yet. And it's getting dark, and they are going along, and they end up turning onto this old dirt road. And the darkness is falling on them, and it's much darker because, you know, the trees are kind of growing across the highway and kind of shutting out the last little bit of sunlight. And the father finds a wide spot and says, you know, we're going to go back. There's got to be something in town. We'll stay in a motel if we have to. But, you know, we're not going to stay out here in the dark. So they turn around, and they're going back down the road, headed for the pavement. And that's when a little girl, just out of nowhere, steps out into the middle of the road. The man stops the car real hard, jerking everybody, because a child just stepped out of nowhere. And she was dressed in what he said were tattered clothes, and she appeared to be very frightened. He said, my father rolled the window down and said, what are you doing out here? Are you okay? And the little girl said to him, "You shouldn't be here. Please go back." And he said, my mom said, opened the window and said, "Sweetheart, we can't leave you here by yourself. You need to come with us. Come on." And the little girl shook her head no, and just turned and walked into the trees and was gone. Well, you can imagine how disconcerting that would have been. And the guy keeps going down the road. He gets back to pavement and finds a place for them to spend the night. This is still bugging them. And, they're speculating on maybe we should have gotten out of the car and went to get her, and then maybe it's a better thing than we didn't, kind of a deal. And what did she mean we shouldn't be here? Go back. So they had found a place, as I said, to stay, but it was actually a campsite about 4 miles from where they had seen the little girl. And they're getting supper and still talking a little bit about it, thinking maybe we should call the police and let them know, what we saw. It could be something bad. As they're sitting there eating supper, this is what he says. He says, "There was this primordial screech from out of the black of the night, and then there was a thing that loped out of the trees into the light of our campfire. It had sharp teeth, no fur, the size of a bear, but its eyes were yellow. We froze in fear. It stood for 10 seconds in the light, then galloped off into the forest. The dog began to whimper, pushing against my mom's legs, trying to hide. We have no idea what we saw. It was extremely skinny, like flesh and bones. It was a disturbing thing. I'll never forget it. And I don't know if it has anything to do with the little girl or not, but my dad packed us up and we left that night. And all I can tell you is maybe we really were in the wrong place and we needed to get out of there." That very much reminds me of the Ridge Road monster.
Mm-hmm.
Thin, gray, skin and bones.
But was there a sinkhole?
I don't know.
Hmm.
But it's an interesting story. And the dog reacted very similarly to the dogs at the edge of that compound where the Ridge Road monster was, where the dogs climbed into their boxes and got terribly quiet and wouldn't come out to eat or drink. It's an interesting story.
But I didn't. If you did say, I apologize, but I didn't hear you mention anything about when they saw the little girl, if the dog reacted at that point or not.
He didn't say that the dog reacted at that point. He just said that it scared them, and then they kept going and then found a spot they could rent a campsite about 4 miles from where the little girl had been seen. And he doesn't know for sure the two things went together, but he thinks they might.
Yeah, I would say that there's a really good chance, because are you going to see two apparently supernatural things happening and just say, oh, they're just two separate supernatural things that happen? That doesn't seem likely.
No, I agree. I agree. But he just couldn't, like he said, I just can't tell you how they fit together.
Unless the little girl was the monster.
Exactly.
Yeah. She ended up following them to wherever they were camping. Yeah.
That's a big possibility. It's definitely a possibility. And I just thought it was an interesting story. So we're going to talk about one more weird story, and then I'm going to let everybody go camping after this. So this took place in Manzano Mountains in northern New Mexico in 2001. The gentleman identifies himself as David, and he says that he and his girlfriend were out camping. They had loved to camp. They had done it many times. And he said he had heard, he had been sleeping. They were both sound asleep in their tent when all of a sudden he woke up to what he calls a cacophony of barking and howling just outside the tent. He was thinking coyotes or something. So that brings him up to his knees, because he's like, holy crap, they're just on the other side of that piece of tent. And as he jumps up, he reaches over and flips on a little lantern they had in the tent. And he said, I could see my girlfriend was listening, and I thought I saw her leaning up from her sleeping bag on one elbow, with her head tilted upward toward the roof of the tent. There was this terrified expression on her face. I was just about to laugh and ask her if she was that afraid of a coyote when I realized I wasn't looking at her. This was a figure right above my girlfriend's body. Whatever it was had reddish hair and was wearing a black cloak and hood. In my mind, I wondered, why are you so scared? I tried to get the spirit to look in my eyes, but it wouldn't. It would look past me, but it wouldn't make eye contact.
Hmm.
And I moved forward as if to try to get to it to pull my girlfriend back. And the thing dissolved into thin air. And I could see the top of my girlfriend's face and head, and she had been laying in the sleeping bag. The howling coyotes were gone as well, and I could only wonder what I had seen. Girlfriend woke up at that point, and he decided they should probably sleep in the car the rest of the night. What if this was one of the shapeshifters, a skinwalker, something like that,
Hmm.
and it was attempting to take her over? That
Hmm.
was my first gut instinct.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's
Wow.
the right areas. You hear the coyote yipping and carrying on, and then it shifts into the side into the female witch, and then it tries to take her energy. It was literally over top of her, trying to morph into her
Hmm.
when he awoke. So with
Dang.
that, I'm going to have to say, everybody enjoy your camping and good night.